Hello and welcome back again to the next episode of Vocation. Once more, I'm joined by the great Michael Tsarion. Thank you very much, Michael, for coming back in. We've had a great roll so far, so hopefully we can just sort of keep the magic going. And we're going to build upon a few of the topics that we were previously discussing. It's mainly in regards to psychology. We've really went deeply into sort of what consciousness is, the study of the psyche and the different structures within that. The name Freud has come up many times because we're using a lot of his sort of framework initially to understand that. And I guess we just wanted to evolve in what we were discussing. And so we were going to discuss one of your articles today called Happy Discontents. Do you want to give us a little brief introduction into what might be in this article? I'll call it up in a little minute and we'll go through it.
Sure. It's a very good article on many levels. But if, say, somebody listening to us has never heard about Freud or has only heard bad things, well, it's a good one to start with then. It's not very long, but it does justice in a compressed form to where he was at. And it might be also a bit surprising to people to know that the American APA and the Catholic Church hated Freud with a passion. And so his books were mistranslated in America by the Psychiatric Association, by publishers, and the Catholic Church also, which was very, very strong in America, more strong than most people even realize, right? Also were very against him. So they tried to play up the fact that he was a Jew, and they tried to play up the fact that he was, a bit on the conservative side. They pumped up the idea that he was an atheist, you see, and even they attacked some of his friends and colleagues. The few who tried to promote his work in America, they also came under attack. So a lot of people don't realize this, that there was actually a conspiracy against Freud. On Unslaved, we have an actual podcast on it. But this article sort of, just does a brief job to show you that this was the case. That's one thing that it does. Quite shocking. And then, of course, the idea of the rest of the article is to go into some of the things we've been talking about, which deal with the Oedipal stages, these early stages after, these are the natal stages, postnatal stages, and what happens at that phase. And we're always talking generally between like 1 and 7 years old. What happens during that time is having an effect later on teenage existence and on adult life. This was what Freud and some of his followers were very concerned about. And they wanted to try and introduce and push this idea, you see. So we wanted to analyze that and see if there's any validity to it. Now, I personally think there is. And so the article argues that unless you really want to deeply understand our times, then you need to read it. And you need to take on at least some of these basic Freudian ideas. They did at the time, right? When Freud wrote, he changed the world. He's one of the greatest thinkers ever, not just of the 20th century or whatever, but of all time. And although his teachings have sort of lapsed, and some have been expanded and others have been critiqued, nevertheless, we need to have him as part of the narrative. And this article is to show you why. It's a short article to prove that point, to say, hey, society, you're not doing the right thing if you leave him out, and if you leave out psychology and psychoanalysis. For all of its flaws, for all of the potential criticisms that it has, it's still necessary, because it's really ultimately about the man, human beings discovering who they are. And remember, psychoanalysis is only about 100 years old. So it's one of the newer sciences that's been added, and therefore some of its flaws can be understood. It's not hundreds and hundreds of years old. Like, it doesn't go back to the time of Isaac Newton or Copernicus or Galileo. Okay? It doesn't go back to Democritus, in ancient Greece. It goes back to 1930. Okay?
It's brand
1890.
new.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it took time for it to develop, and there's plenty of room, but for further development. But the trouble is, along come feminism, along came pluralism, and along came, this ardent left-wing socialism, and then again along came these conservative orgs in America, that then tried to mutilate what was happening. Even a lot of existentialists came along that poo-pooed, what Freud was doing. So it came under virulent attack. And all the time they were raiding the larder. Most of the time when you go and look at the great critics of psychoanalysis, they're criticizing the hell out of it while they're loading up their pockets. Their own teachings, right, are absolutely laden with hybridized versions of what they've, it's like busting in, grabbing a lot of stuff, and then running off down the street with it.
Yep,
All
yep.
great thinkers have been heavily plagiarized, and Freud is no different. It's just that it might have been thinly disguised or something, in the latter days, but there you have it. So just walk through people through some of the basics, and it has some validity under what we've been talking about here, because it definitely talks about the superego,
Mm-hmm.
and we can talk about that again if you want.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, super. So I'll call the article up and we'll just read through a little bit of it and then we'll maybe just riff off of that. So just give me one wee second. I'll call that up for everyone. So hopefully everybody can see this. This is Michael Tsarion's article, Happy Discontents and the Unreality Principle. It starts off with a little quote from Gustave Le Bon, which reads, "The masses have never thirsted after truth. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master." And then it gets into
Well,
here.
you don't really
Oh,
have
yes.
to. You don't really have to read anymore. I think we can finish the podcast right there.
There we go,
I
in
mean,
a
that is
nutshell.
it. That is it in a nutshell. Yeah, you bet.
Yeah.
You bet.
And this phrase, the masses, this is something that comes up so often. It's about the crowd, it's about the masses. And it's sort of this sort of duel between the individual and with the group. And we really get into the psychology of the differences of those, because that's so pertinent to what we've been discussing. So just under the first paragraph here. Sigmund Freud's final book on psychology, published in 1930, was entitled Civilization and Its Discontents. Some of Freud's friends and associates complained that this title isn't a proper translation from the German. Psychologist Bruno Bettelheim noticed that much of Freud's writing had been repeatedly taken out of context and mistranslated to give readers, and the general public, the impression that Freud was a committed materialist. A quote from Bruno himself: "I discovered that reading Freud in English translation leads to quite different impressions from those I had formed when I'd read him in German." Have you any comments so far, Michael?
Yeah, exactly as I was saying. So he had some supporters. They came under attack. He had many people, celebrities, go to get therapy, not from him, but from the supporters. They came under attack. Certain actors, and sadly, there was a bunch of movies at the time. You'd be amazed, actually, in the 1950s, and then creeping into the 60s. Yeah, probably decent 50s was a heyday for Freudian films. You did get them later. Alfred Hitchcock was still trying to do it in the late 50s and even into the 60s with Vertigo and Marnie and all that. But they all came under attack. Every film that Hitchcock made that had a direct Freudian theme was a flop. Yeah. And all the other lesser known films, a little bit lower budget, still fantastic. I would watch these films just for film buffs. For anybody that just loves deep acting and superb acting, should watch them anyway. Forget about the psychoanalysis. But the very fact that they contained these psychoanalytical themes, they were flops. And no matter how hard these directors and actors and actresses tried, Joan Crawford acted in several. She was a very world famous actress. Others did as well. It just didn't work. People didn't like to see their John Wayne strutting heroes having mother complexes or being weak in any way. The great Gregory Peck and Jimmy Stewart. No, no, no. We can't have American males that have been icons of the silver screen sitting on couches, in a state of worry about some of their dreams, like in the case of Spellbound, the guy's having bad dreams and nightmares. Oh, we don't like that. Where's the gunfights? Where's the love scenes? Where's the car chases? So America was just like, no way, we don't want to know. And so a very, very, very great opportunity. But I give it to the actors, though. They tried. They really did try. It's not that it went down with a whimper. It was millions and millions of dollars were spent. Brilliant scripts were written. Brilliant stuff. Some of it's so good, it's quite amazing. Carl Jung's books were even listed by name, even mentioned by name in some of these films, for goodness sake. It didn't help. What basically happened is that America showed, no, we're not interested. We're not interested in the German thing. You and I talked about that before. There was a time when a little bit of German thought, did get hold, traction in America with the transcendentalists and one or two other areas, but that was mostly poetry. America, again, just was not in the right mood for that. You had your pragmatists, not all of them. Some of the pragmatists are absolutely excellent, so let's get that clear. No, it was more what we actually call analytical. To be more precise, analytical school of philosophy took over. It's the anti-transcendentalists. It's the anti-idealist motif. I've got a lot of time for the early pragmatists like William James and Charles Peirce. These are two of the greatest minds America's ever produced. But later on, you get your pragmatists, like John Dewey. Yes, they are a problem, right? As you move more into the 20th century. And the later pragmatists after him are even worse. So they are certainly to blame, but mostly it's this thing called the analytical school. I'm giving words, that people can look up, the analytical school. And this is then leads to where? 20th century, B.F. Skinner, J.B. Watson, behaviorism. Can you imagine this, right? And that was borrowed from not the German model, but from the Soviet model of Pavlov, right? Dogs salivating, rats and mazes. Can you imagine that the Americans, who are meant to be on paper the enemies of the Soviet Russia, completely wholesale borrow this Pavlovian behaviorist model and install it and nobody said a word? Yeah. Look at the horror of that. And it took people like Thomas Zaz, and to give him his due, Noam Chomsky, leftist as he is. Nevertheless, he did stand up against behaviorism, and that's to his credit.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe even to frame this a little bit more, I have Bruno's book here. I remember hearing you mention it before, Freud, A Man's Soul,
Oh,
and
wow.
it's unbelievable. People have to get it. It's
Yeah.
not a very big book, but just to frame the conversation of how the Americans were getting a different translation of what Freud actually meant. In the very opening of the book, there's a little quote from one of his letters to Carl Jung, and it basically just reads that psychoanalysis is in essence a cure through love. How different does that come across to what
That's right.
you understand by how
Isn't that
Freud's
amazing?
conveyed today?
Yes.
Yeah,
You see, this is
yeah,
when you do your own
unbelievable.
research.
Yeah,
Yes, and
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
so glad you got that book because it's fantastic. And it's not the only one. L. White, there's been other books written in support of it all.
Hmm,
But this one stands out.
hmm,
And look at that. What is love, right? So the idea of Freud bringing a human being in to sit down and to lie on a couch, an eye to eye, tell me about your intimate personal life. The very premise alone is something remarkable because in our normal relationships, most of us don't even do that. You see, he was trying to replicate something that is not even done in normal life. He really was pushing the boundaries, and he was testing it when he did 3 or 4 different things. There was a free association, there was the talking cure, there was the dreams analysis. He tried different things. If you get into it, you'll find out he didn't just settle on one. He tried hypnosis. You see, there's about 4 or 5 different attempts to get it right. So this man was, but not as locked down as people think. He in his own life had tried several different strategies, techniques, and he was open to others as well. So when you come at him with criticism, one has to be a lot more liberal minded and a little bit more open than what we've seen. Now, what we've seen has been a conspiracy. There's going to be no doubt about that. Bruno Bettelheim's book proves it. Other works prove it, and Freud's own words prove it. If you see, he did write one later book. Civilization and Its Discontents is the last psychological book. But after that, he wrote another book, which isn't on psychology. It's on Akhenaten, the Pharaoh Akhenaten, right? And it's called Moses and Monotheism. Now, reading the mere introduction of that book is fascinating because Freud warns that his greatest enemies in the world are the Catholic Church, the Jesuits. Yes. So you get it from his own lips. He knew that these priests in black robes don't want anyone falling away from their power. They want sinners. They want confessionals. They want a bevy of black robes. These are the psychoanalysts they like. Those who can crush you underfoot, those who can have you, wrapped up in your womb metaphors, your supernaturalisms, and the power of the priest. And when psychoanalysis came along, the Catholic Church was literally rocked to its foundations. That's why I wrote this article, just to let people see who would be threatened by this. Follow the money, follow the checks. Why would they give a damn about some Viennese Jew, right, and what he's doing in that corner of the world? No. America had decided very, very early on, we don't want this. We love these old women, the ones you get today, the boomers, right? We love this generation crawling in to the church, sitting there in the dark, thinking of themselves as abysmal sinners, listening to every word the priest The priest is, I mean, you just have to think of our country, Ireland, right? I mean, freaking hell. The power of the priest, okay, luckily it got thrown over later on, but the power of the priest was everything. He disciplined children. He'd come in and whip the kids' asses if they were misbehaving. He frowned upon, contraception. He frowned upon any kind of extramarital, shenanigans. The priest ruled
Moral
in the,
authority of the community.
he
Yeah.
was totally and utterly, and the power that he had went to his head often, and that's where you get all the priestly abuse also coming because they thought they were emperors, they thought they were kings. But a lot of people don't realize just how strong they were in America. There's a very good movie with Paul Newman called The Verdict. The Verdict was made in 1970s, maybe the early 80s. People should watch that film. It has some excellent themes that back up what I'm talking. There are other movies as well, but that one's so superbly made. People
Yeah.
really do need to see it, because it's great entertainment as well. The Verdict with Paul
Yeah.
Newman, but it features some things that people need, to corroborate what we're saying.
Yeah, and I think there's more recent documentaries out about, the scandals with the Catholic Church
Certainly.
and the children
Well, there
things.
is. Thank
Yeah,
goodness. Yeah.
yeah. Tons of stuff for that, which is exactly on point of what we're talking about, and this corruption of power that comes about. But
Yes.
yeah, I'll call up a bit more of the article and we'll go through a bit more and more of it if that's all right with you too, Michael.
Sure, sure, sure.
Yes, there was bits here that Bruno had written, which I'll just read through and then we'll go through them if that's all right with you.
Absolutely.
So this is from Bruno once more. Instead of instilling a deep feeling for what is most human in all of us, the translations attempt to lure the reader into developing a scientific attitude towards man and his actions, a scientific understanding of the unconscious and how it conditions much of our behavior. The translation of those personal pronouns into their Latin equivalents, the ego and the id, rather than their English ones, turn them into cold technical terms, which arouse no personal associations. In German, the pronouns are invested with deep emotional significance for the readers have used them all their lives. Some of the translations are so obviously wrong that it is difficult to see why they were ever made, and even more difficult to see why they were not corrected long ago. Saying something quite different from what Freud had in mind, or from what he was talking about in the rest of the article or book at hand, they baffle the reader. And so, I think the most pressing bit that comes out of that with me is how these scientific terms, the ego and the id, how they don't arouse any sort of personal associations as Bruno described. Have you any thoughts on that, Michael?
Well, I can well believe what Bruno Bettelheim is saying there. It makes perfect
Mm,
sense on that larger macro picture of why things are the way they are today. Because these Freuds and Otto Rank and people like that had a deep, deep concern, deeper than most of us do today, about the future. They arrived in the early 20th century. They saw what was coming and they didn't like it. And so there is love involved. There is care and concern. But they didn't realize that the architects of control, and especially in terms of the American experiment, they were threatened deeply by this. So Bettelheim is aware of this. So he's writing his book, you see. Yes, of course, it's a defense of Sigmund Freud, and that alone makes it interesting. That's why I picked it up. I'm just interested in that alone, right? But then as I started to contemplate, wait a minute, I can see a darker hand at work. Yeah. And now, of course, for some strange reason, Carl Jung was more a darling to America. It's just a symbiotic thing. Yeah, he came also a couple of times, and he, instead of Freud, they kind of didn't like Freud. They sneered at Freud, and they decided he was persona non grata. And he didn't like the place either, so that worked. You know, that was a marriage made in hell. Freud didn't like America, and he didn't want to know after he'd visited the place, right? In fact, he went so far as to counsel his friends not to bother him anymore with what America was doing to his works. He said he didn't care. He said they're so infantile and so far gone, they could never employ what he was talking about anyway. Yeah, this is his own words. He goes, I'm not concerned with them. They could never get it in the month of Sundays. So listen, find something else to be bothered with. And his friends were shocked. They thought they're sending him detailed letters and detailed reports about, what they're doing and how they mistranslated this book, and look at the cover and look what they're saying. And he just wrote back and said, nah, leave me alone. Don't bother me with it. I'm writing the place off. And he's not the only one. There's others who have done this as well. America had been visited by the great poet John Keats. by Oscar Wilde, by Alex de Tocqueville, and many others. And some of them came away going, yeah, an interesting experiment, but none of us expect it to, to work ultimately, But back to Carl Jung, for some reason, a personality quirk or whatever, he was more accepted. Not a lot, but in comparison to Freud, yes, he became the darling. Maybe he was able to tone down what he was about. Maybe he put it into different contexts. Maybe he avoided pissing them off. I really don't know, but I must say he did well. He did well. Maybe it was again just coming at a different time. Maybe it was not being Jewish. He was this huge, broad-shouldered, Aryan-looking Gentile guy, who was not German but Swiss. And so something about his masculinity or whatever, he just went a little bit better down as a poster child for psychoanalysis. So that must be said. Now, this doesn't mean that his teachings really were any more loved at the end of the day. We can't say that American just went, oh, we're going to become all Jungians now. No, that didn't happen. No, the man that they went for, that America loved, was Edward Bernays. Now, he just happened to be a nephew of Freud, but there's a very, very tentative connection. No, they liked him because he fit the pattern of saying psychoanalysis is nothing more. Its benefit, its greatest benefit, is getting the proles, getting the workers to be obedient servants of the rotten system. In other words, it's good for adjusting discontents and getting them back in line. America went, oh, you're hired. Madison Avenue went, oh yeah, we're for that. That sells our cigarettes. It sells our soap. It sells our cosmetics. It sells our Folgers smile. You're in, mate. We did a test. We saw that the public were coming out of the cinemas going, what the fuck was that all about? Give us Psycho. So Alfred Hitchcock did make Psycho, and the crowds were around the block. They loved it. And it started off a whole spate of, Freddy movies and all this, right? And Friday the 13th. Yeah, they loved that. Made by the same director who made 5 of the greatest psychological films, and every one of them was a flop. I think America has spoken. So the Madison Avenue and the government knew immediately, we're onto a good thing. The people don't want it, but they want this. They want to, act like sheep. They want to be sold a lie. And so we have no problem sweeping aside this German Swiss, German Austrian nonsense. We can easily replace it. It's a lot of palaver, but we'll have to have it covered. Let's have it covered for the intellectuals. So we'll bring in some of this French deconstructionist garbage at the top. We'll bring that in just in case the intellectuals still want to go for psychoanalysis. We'll bring in this analytical philosophy. And then as we move down towards the working class, we'll also have our replicas. We'll have our pop culture. We'll have our drug smoking, promotion of, teenage rebellion and hippie ethic, whatever. They've always got 1,000,001 peace and love, philosophies. Bring in these towel heads from the East. We got to ask, why did that all happen simultaneously? You have a great deep Western tradition coming out of Germany and Austria, and suddenly it's swept aside by a bunch of towel heads from the Ganges. All these first New Ager creatures came in, from the India. Yeah, and the New Age starts up. Why? So I'm looking at all of this, because I was part of the New Age movement back in the late 70s and 80s. And I started to see the pattern as I grew up and started to look at the hollowness of it, that this was made to order. This thing was stitched up at the back, this New Age stuff, it was a mannequin. It was horrible. Yeah. And they too were leaving out substance. They were leaving out things of great substance, which is thrown to the wayside. You and I have talked about the teachings of Krishnamurti, again, why is that not getting traction? So again, I started to ask questions and went in search of the answers, that a lot of what's being sold to Western man by the East is nothing but a bunch of womb metaphors, things like that.
Yeah. And we'll come into that more in the article, I think, as it's evolving. This picture will come into much more details, especially Edward Bernays and his role in all of this. Yes. I think he wrote a book called Propaganda, didn't he? I think it was literally called Propaganda. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right.
I believe he's titled, he's known as the father of modern propaganda. So
Correct.
It's so apropos of what we've been discussing about, these architects of control and about how they use psychology.
Yes.
So Yeah.
There's a great series of books by a guy called Vance Packard. The Hidden Persuaders was his great. It was a bestseller. So here's another paradox. For a very, very short time in the 70s, right? This is just a couple of years. There was an interest among some American intellectuals with this idea of psychological control, a la Bernays. He's not the only one. Other people had written books on this kind of thing. And for a very, very short time, in fact, even a movie was made. It's called Agency with Robert Mitchum and Lee Majors. Very good film. And it's on subliminal advertising, of all things. A deep look, right? This is extraordinary. And there were one or two other little movies here and there. Nothing much. But it did creep into the zeitgeist by other decent people who, again, didn't want to let it down so quickly. And so they realized, look, let's try again through some of our series. So it didn't die completely. There was a heyday in the 40s and 50s, but that didn't work. But then in the 70s, it kind of popped up its head again a little bit in a few shows, which I know about, and a couple of books, mostly by this guy, Vance Packard. And then, of course, it died away. These were spinner rack books, kind of good bestsellers at the time, but then it fell away. And from that point on, it never, ever got traction again, sadly. But you're quite right. The Edward Bernays thing was the one that was taken to heart by the American industrialist control, what you would call, the industrial complex, the deep state. They started to say, hey, there is something here after all. Let's make sure we keep suppressing it to the public, but we want more of these books. Let's find out. And so that's how the conspiratorial aspect opened up in my life. I realized that psychology is very important in America, but not in the way that was healthy.
I understand. I'll call up a little bit more of the article and we'll go through that a little bit further. So this will be our next little segment. We have another quote by Bruno. It starts with, in his work and in his writings, Freud often spoke of the soul, of its own nature and structure, its development, its attributes, how it reveals itself in all we do and dream. Unfortunately, nobody who reads him in English could guess this, because nearly all his many references to the soul and to matters pertaining to the soul have been excised in translation. And so this is a little bit you wrote after. Bettelheim's excellent book reveals how the American Psychological Association, also known as the APA, deliberately and maliciously misinterpreted and subverted Freudianism. Bettelheim expressly tells readers that the only element of Freud's pratique that interested American medical organizations was that geared to making the public adjustable to government control. In other words, if a treatment helped get the average discontent back in line, it was to be hastily adopted. The rest of it could be trashed. The Catholic Church agreed. They didn't care to have their priests put out of business by the advent of psychoanalysis. They wanted their confessionals crammed with sinners wrecked by despair and guilt. Consequently, as far as America was concerned, Freud was persona non grata. Bettelheim himself came under attack and was professionally assassinated for his well-meaning attempts to change America's mind about his mentor's pratique. So, any thoughts there, Michael, on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think we've covered that. I mean, that was the way it was. And a whole era was changed. Now, you had your intellectuals, you had your wealthy Hollywood, some of the Hollywood actors, not just from Hollywood, also the East Coast, who had psychological problems. And they were open about it in their own personal lives. And they warmed to psychoanalysis. Some of their sons and daughters were seeing therapists, right? It was an in thing for a while. And of course, they're movie actors and directors. And they said, this is so important, we have to publicize it. And then in another article on my Dragon Mother site, I list, there's an article there called Science of Vertigo. And in that, I list all the different movies I could remember that did have those themes. I didn't do it in this article, but there's another. And they said, to hell with this is great content. And America's going to rally. Come on, let's do it. And they went with gusto. Do you know that even Sean Connery, in one of his earliest films, agreed? He was in the middle of the James Bond, series. And Alfred Hitchcock said, hey, we need a really big star to act in a movie about deep psychology. And he said, yes. And he broke the model and he came and was a protagonist in one of Hitchcock's greatest movies on psychology. Very, very, very controversial themes in the movie. And he said yes, but none of it worked. Nobody knew this. Nobody could predict. So this is not the Illuminati holding a gun to anybody's head. This is the individual themselves going, not for me. No, no, no. Give me some more dance scenes. Give me some more Fred Astaire, right? Give me some more Walt Disney. And they got it. And they reduced the psychology to horror, being scared shitless, right? Chainsaw Massacre followed. I think you get my point, right? Yeah. Sold out. No problem. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Psycho. Can't wait. Hand out the popcorn. No problems there. And basically the rest of the Western world followed suit. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a great tradition that was basically parked. And a massive campaign of disinformation, which is where Bruno Bettelheim and others come in, also to follow, just in case anybody went back a little bit to sniff around, and got a little bit of interest. No, they'll be put off. We don't want any of that stuff. And they did and as far as I'm concerned, they did a great job.
Yeah, I'll continue on with a little bit of the reading here. In an interesting essay entitled Why Freud Hated America, the author states that Freud noted that during his only short visit to the United States, he was physically weaker than he had ever been in his life. After contracting his 10th symptom, he decided to return to Europe and never return. The theme of civilization and its discontents concerns the condition and fate of socialized humans, those calling themselves civilized. What does the term really allude to? Or more to the point, is civilized man any happier now than he was as a creature in the wild? Freud did not believe man was essentially happier in his urban environments. This is because in order to be civilized, one's basic instincts must be dramatically suppressed and denied. In other words, there's a great cost involved in being civilized. One isn't able to do as they please, not without serious consequences. However, as Freud brilliantly elucidated, punishment for antisocial behavior isn't administered exclusively by external sources. Internally, civilized people hear a penalizing voice in the form of the superego, the part of us that judges our actions and relentlessly hectors us for the slightest infraction of socially imposed standards. Although the superego develops continually through life, the first 7 years are crucial. By 7, the likes and dislikes of one's parents are well and truly introjected. Their expectations, once internalized, become the permissive and prohibitive voices within our heads, conditioning our thinking and behavior. And so I think the main theme of that is how becoming civilized, and there's the downside that's involved in it as well also. What are your thoughts on what happens to people as they become civilized? Would people be happier if they were more in touch with nature or more primitive as how they used to live?
Yeah, this is, of course, the big question that even Freud spent his whole life asking. And his last book, Civilization and Its Discontents, was more of even a deeper meditation on it. He believed that you do need civilization. And I believe that too, right? I go along exactly with Freud's thinking. But at what cost? You see? Now, the theory does rest, you and I have talked about this before, that it's based on the idea that man is originally and essentially a beast. Okay, now this is where, everyone could then join the argument and go, no, I don't accept that. But according to Freud, there's plenty of evidence, and I go through some of it in the article. Some of the behavior of teens, children, and our sort of terrible love of war would be, the most obvious. But there's plenty more. The football games, the wrestling, the boxing, these crazy news shows where people sit down and start eating worms and eating cockroaches and all. Freud would look at a lot of that. He'd look at basically just what's out there phenomenologically and say, what is all of this? Isn't this like a back to the jungle type of mentality? He'd certainly look to the New Age, penchant for that. He'd look to this neo-primitivism. He'd find loads of evidence that man wants to regress back. See, now we have to add this on the side. Say you had a divided screen and you said, let's give some check marks on one side to Freud and some X's on the other side, where we can see things in society that go against the grain. But the trouble is, when you start doing that, it's all green on one side and hardly fuck all on the other side. Freud gets a lot of stuff start to mark on his side that you wouldn't first think of. And then this alters our kind of, way of looking at it. It becomes a lot harder. And on top of that, you get all the mistranslations and mutilations of his work to factor in as well. Once you start taking it all together. But to answer your question, you see, he says civilization's a necessary thing. We're glad to have it. But can it last? Yeah, under the crust of the civilization cap. What happens if it's turning to pus? If we lift up the hood every now and again to check, Is it strong? And we keep finding out that, the wires are melting and things are turning liquid, liquefying in the engine room. No, or we're running out of fuel or something's going. He was kept awake at night thinking, is this thing going to last? What can we do to improve it? So he himself is not a discontent. He himself is not a malcontent. He's in favor of civilization, but he's down there in his overalls checking the cracks in the hull, right? He's looking for the fissure. He's looking for the time bomb. And he's going, can anybody hear something ticking? And everybody goes, what are you talking about? He goes, I can hear something ticking. I can sense that something's wrong here. Nobody could, but he was influenced by Schopenhauer. He was influenced by Spengler, and he was influenced by Gustave Le Bon, right? Whose opening quote is at the top of the article. All of whom believed, like he did, that civilization is a very temporary thing at best, and argued for it, right? So, in order to counter argue, you'd have to get into each one of those people. You'd have to really do a monumental work, because I'm telling you, they all may be wrong, including Freud. But how are you going to know? Do you realize the research and the reading of each of these men? And you can throw in even your Nietzsche's in there somewhere at some point, and a few others as well. Not every philosopher was a progressive in the true sense of that word, which meant optimistic, that life is moving towards a 0 point, a good place, a utopia. In fact, when you really get into it, the whole concept of utopia, Otto Rank would have laughed at your ideas of utopia. And he would have said, why is it that these books that are on utopia, be it, any of the utopians, there's loads of them, the communitarians, but even somebody like Terence McKenna, this neo-hippie, neo-pagan kind of cult that goes around, right? They're very, very, very strong, and I critique them in the article. Isn't the future just another womb metaphor? According to Otto Rank, it is. We wouldn't even be able to follow the train of thought. What? Womb metaphor? How do you get that? Because you've got to read the man. You've got to know what is a womb metaphor. It's not progressive. It sounds like it is. That's the window dressing. That's the self-deception to say, tomorrow's world is going to be brighter and better, and we're going to live in a brotherhood of man. Otto Rank would have laughed at that. Freud would have laughed at that. He goes, man projects these womb metaphors, where everything's going to be bright and beautiful, but you can't falsify it. You pick out certain things, certain areas or timelines or whatever, so in one school, the past was the womb metaphor. Hey, it was better in primitive life. Man lived in the jungle. He roamed free. He frolicked in the Garden of Eden. That was the better life. But of course, some people have seen through that. They go, I don't think we can push that. But I believe in extopia. I believe in utopia. I believe that tomorrow, look at all the communists who believe this. When you really push a communist, he'll always be telling you that their doctrine is flawed now because we are just in the stage of building tomorrow's utopia. Shut you up. We're communists. You keep pointing our flaws, but that's because we're only halfway up the ladder. Get out of our way. We mean well. You see? So under this other womb metaphor of the future, which it can be anything, who's going to tell you what? You don't even know in your own life what your future is going to be, let alone for mankind. But what a con job, right? To say, oh, we're going to fix everything. Didn't Mao Zedong think that?
Great leap forward. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So this is a laughable, in psychoanalysis, utopianism holds no water whatsoever, zero, except for the fact that it's another self-deceptive mode, which people get into because they're actually regressive. And I make this very clear in the article in several places, right? That this utopianism, which is the woke are into it. The communists are certainly into it. The New Agers are into it. These neo-primitives are into it. Some billionaires who bankroll it are into it. And they have, what they've done? They've put up their little people's champions. I won't mention their names, even in this movement, who sell you this jive, right? I've been attacked because I won't join their crowd, right? But I mentioned their names in the article. And so this is a very, very powerful cult. But it's all based in womb metaphor. So once you know the psychological underpinning of the thing, well, then you just don't join it. And you don't let other people join it. Like I do in my message, I try to warn people about this. It's got nothing to do with a genuine concern for the future. It's rooted in psychological regression. And this is where Freud, I think, then, is extremely valuable. And so are the Freudians.
Yeah, well, continue on with the article and just try to elucidate on a little bit more of what we've been discussing there. So, the article continues. We are not asked to interject parental imagos and obey parental dictates. It's demanded. Parenting is for the most part a form of adultism, and that is tyranny. Children aren't taught, they're trained, like performing seals. Freudians rightly describe the superego as the tyrant in the head. It is responsible for the most neurotic traits and internal tension. And this is something we spoke about last time. It was crucially about how the superego dramatically magnifies that parental imago and their hectoring voices, which in turn means that the demands of the inner voice are bound to be, in most cases, more severe than those of one's physical parents. Each child is literally flooded with guilt for even the slightest infraction of society's standards. The situation can become so unbearable that a person may not only become highly neurotic, but may decide to mentally and emotionally regress to a period before the advent of the superego. This pathological condition is what we now find rampant among millennials and members of the woke thugocracy. So that perfectly ties into what you were saying there just before. We have this repression of instincts, and this leads to these self-hatred that then comes as a result of that as well also. How do people
See, oh, well, I was just going to say, I'm glad you read that part because we have anatomized some of the functions of the superego. But this is good because this is the one that's usually accepted by psychologists. Some of the other ones we did were a deeper dive. I still think they're valuable. But believe you me, if listeners to our work here have found it a little bit difficult, then just get this one. This is the big all caps rule of the superego. Get me the approval of the masses. Okay. So if all the other ones that were a deeper dive just can't, it takes more time to download, that's okay. I don't fault you for that. But get this one as the number one download. The superego's most important function in the human head, right, is this direction to say, follow these dictates. And if you don't, you're going to be flooded with guilt to get you back in line. Now, when people said, but I have had good parents, so I don't know why I've turned out this way, or I've read a story about a very, very seriously pathological type of person, like a Ted Bundy or what have you, or a Jeffrey Dahmer, and then you go back and look at their parents and the argument is that they weren't that bad. I don't get this Freudian stuff. I think it's shite. That's because you turned over 2 pages at once. The law is that the superego magnifies the imagos and magnifies their voice. So you don't necessarily have to have extremely tyrannous physical parents. This part's missed out, and so we all go haywire. And Freudians who mean well but haven't read their Freud properly don't get this, and therefore they can't argue, to the critics. I've noticed this. But the Freudian who does know this, he's invulnerable. Because the superego's function is to magnify. And then this is so damn important. Because one of the things that the magnification does is it makes you more inclined to identify with the object of your hate. Why identify with a power that's there, but not that captivating? But by the time the superego has magnified imagine that, it's like shadows on a wall. In the light, it's just a tiny thing. But in the superego, this thing is huge. It's a fucking giant. I'm going to think that little stick is a huge club. This is how it works. And therefore, the very pathology of identifying with the tyrant is more likely because of this magnification. But the other thing is that when the superego is wielding this big stick and flooding us with guilt, we are forced to go along with its dictates. And then comes in the cherry on the top. Then comes the carrot. We'll lower guilt once you conform. So don't you see everybody's got blue hair? And everybody's got smelly armpits, and everybody, has their Che Guevara t-shirt? What are you doing? Don't you see all these beliefs? You better get in line, buddy. So get those piercings. You want to signal to everyone around you you're the same as them. Start sprouting the same old shite that they're talking about. And that's what we do. Because remember, we're not talking about conformity to the world anymore. The Marcusean Fabian network has said, but we'll make it so that you concentrate on conforming to the group the fringe group or the sort of smaller, more urban group that you belong to. It used to be different when you didn't have all these cliques. Then it was more of a universal worldly identification. Then you could be the organization man in the pinstripe suit with the bowler hat and the rolled up umbrella, right? But the one change that has happened is that now there's all these splinter countercultural groups and sects to make identification easier. And that's exactly what you find. It's the mods versus the rockers. It's, all the different groups. Look at what do you think identity politics is? We can explain everything that's happening today. Identity politics is you identifying with your group. That you starts in school and all the girls look exactly the same. They apply the makeup exactly the same. They watch the same fucking shows, right? Everything is exactly the same. They speak exactly in the same accent. All of this is exactly what we're talking about right now. Courtesy of the superego. You must fit in. And if you don't, you're going to be flooded with guilt. That's the number one function of the superego. We talked about its other functions, and to a deeper thinker, they're very important. But this is the generalized one that should be taught in every classroom. Because the ultimate result of this is the death of individuality and the birth of crowd consciousness, right? Now, anything more to add to that? Yes. Because this adjustment to the dictates of the superego is a kind of a violent thing, right? I've already said that the word repression can be easily exchanged with the word oppression. The real oppressor is the superego. But the thing is that there's also something very, very important to know, and it's ironic. When you listen to the dictates of the superego, you're at the same time denying another voice within you, which is the voice of the conscience. And you're doing so violently. Right? You have to violently suppress the voice of the self. Right? This is the dynamic of tension. And this is what breeds neuroticism. Neuroticism is just the outcome of, a tension that won't go away. Okay, but what else? The superego is giving you the carrot as well. Hey, you'll get the payoff, which will lower the guilt that I'm flooding you with when you go and adjust to the crowd. Be that organization man. Be that conformist, okay? And the quicker you do it, the better, because then the guilt comes down. And we go, sorry, I didn't read that part. Okay, here I go. And you join the crowd. And haven't you noticed that when you shove a mic into the face of these social justice warriors and millennials, they're always grinning? Always. They're grinning. They're having a ball. Most of them are high as kites. Yeah. They're laughing at you. They love jumping around, semi-naked, sprouting nonsense. Because they're happy discontents. They're in the crowd and they're happy because the guilt within them is lowered by this conformity. You'll never see them really crying. It's all fake. The crocodile tears when they, forced to, because this is the thing they do with a cause. But why do they get their causes? Where do these beliefs and causes come from? This is based in the pseudo emotionality that's demanded by the superego to show that you're, you virtue signal, that you're a caring person. You're not a caring person. You're a violent person. Your joining of the crowd is a violent act against the self. You never, even though the crowd is feminine typologically, that doesn't make it any less violent. In fact, it is, in my opinion, it's the most violent institution that's ever existed. Is the mob, is the crowd. But your joining of it is not some passive thing where I woke up one day and go, I think I'm going to join a crowd today. No, it's a very, very violent, right? From a typological and psychological point of view, the joining of the crowd is a violent act, one of the most violent because it's against the self. It's a way of you're following the direction of the superego, which, yes, it will give you a modicum of temporary peace. And you also get the silence to guilt. And you also get the amplification of the neurotic ideas that you have because you're in a crowd of so many other people like yourself. Yes, all of these things will allow a certain alleviation, but it's temporary. You need the constant infusion of adrenaline. That's why the people you get into the crowd conscious can't break away from it. They're addicted to it. Oh yeah, but this is a very violent action. Make no mistake about that. Which then leads to an ultimate conclusion. How can people whose whole motive when they join the political crowd, the thugocracy, has been violent, how can they plea for world peace? You see the irony, the contradiction? How can you possibly unchain the world, free another, and petition for world peace when you're riddled in the kind of violence that you don't even know exists? Big Brother is killing themselves laughing. right? They're literally killing themselves laughing at you. But it's your ultimately comes down to your lack of psychological knowledge. And then there's many other syndromes. I don't know. Do you want to go into some more of these syndromes?
Yeah, sure. And what you're speaking about, like, I'm sure people have seen all the videos online. I don't know if you've ever came across Billboard Chris. Are you familiar with his work? Oh, you'll love it. Everything we're talking about, he's perfectly filmed. So this is one guy that just walks around with this billboard on it that essentially says, "Children can't consent to puberty blockers." And so he basically goes around all of the big college campuses and things like that, kind of like how Charlie Kirk used to do. And it's the whole trans lobby and the whole trans ideology that comes up to him with it. That's exactly how you've been just sort of laying it out with it. It's about disobedience. You have this wild group. They're all hysterical. They're all laughing and giggling together with these big crazy smiles on their faces at the same time as they're mutilating themselves. And you should see how easy they are to go from "I'm the victim." He's even got somebody on camera turning on the fake tears, going hysterical. He stands there stoically, and it changes to just this vehement hatred and this wish for violence towards him. And it's so perfectly encapsulated in them. So, yeah, they're well
Yeah,
worth checking out too.
you do get the violence after you've narrowly, confront them one to one. But
Yeah,
when you pull
yeah,
back, the camera and zoom, they're mostly happy. They're mostly going around in this kind of fluffy daze. Yeah. Which is like they're in the circus. Yeah. Yeah. It's only when you narrow in and sort of, pummel them with logic that now that you get their defenses up. But, watch out. Yeah. But see, this the superego also represses the shame of the conscience. Remember, we said that the guilt may lower from the superego, but guess what? The moment that the guilt starts coming down, another syndrome, only known to the top psychologists, is that the shame that you have for living this inauthentic life goes up. So the contract that you made with yourself to join the crowd to lower guilt and listen to the voice of the superego actually doesn't get you anywhere psychologically, because that guilt indeed may, lower, but the internal existential shame of living like a peon and living like a conformist now goes through the roof. And so the tension within you, although it shifted, remains the same. And you now have what's called legitimate suffering, not the neurotic misery. Let me in, let me in. Right? I'm broken down because I'm not accepted by society. I'm sitting here sweating bullets, doctor, because I can't fit in. I can't get those 3 stripes. That's all neurotic misery. But then the psychologist will teach you how to lower that. Oh, just, do these things and, be adjusted. The Bernays type of psychology just adjusts you to the abnormal world, or, go take a pill, the psychiatry. All of that remedy that, treating you like a behaviorist would do. You're just an animal in the maze. But on the other side is this existential shame. Now it goes up. And so you're back at the psychologist. Doctor, still not working. But the doctors don't know anything about the legitimate side because they're not existentialists. They've fallen for this behaviorism. So in society's terms, you'll never find a psychologist who can help you today. I'm one of the only people in the entire movement talking about this. Number one, the only one in our movement. And we're meant to be the enlightened movement? What the hell? Fuck, what's out there? Then then what you have to do, the superego's now got a lot more energy to suppressing that shame. Because sometimes when you don't feel it, well, you do feel it, but the superego now says, okay, we got to develop another Hydra head to shield, to suppress this shame, which is causing more tension, more unrest, more insomnia, more bulimia, more anorexia, and a whole cocktail of pathological syndromes are coming from the suppression of the shame. You may have lowered guilt, but that's not going to save you, because there's another voice within you that represents the natural order, right? Natural law, the cosmic order, that won't let you sleep. And so a true psychologist, when you walk in, they're only interested in finding out whether you're there because of the neurotic guilt or you're there because of legitimate shame. And the therapy cannot be the same. So this is how I have the right to fault all the psychologists out there, the clinical psychologists, the big pharma. I can do it. I can demand from them to tell me, each one of them where they're at. And I know where they're at. I've read the books. I know that they only deal with the neurotic misery, and that it'd be very, very difficult to find an authentic one. Yet you should find more, but you don't. And then on top of this, and people have to listen back to our shows previously. The superego's function exhausts you, right? All of the suppression and all of its functions are very demanding physically. So this breeds overeating, right? And overeating of sweets, because where are you going to find the octane? Where are you going to find the energy? And then if it wasn't horrific enough, something happens to the 20, 30 something. And what happens is this: there's a glut for the sensational person. We already talked about those who can't bring meaning from within. We talked about those who are following the dictates of the superego, all for that carrot. And sometimes you don't even get the carrot. You don't get the approval that you want. And therefore now you have neurotic misery. Because actually the superego contract, just to fill that in, if the superego did give you complete adjustment to society, then what we're saying would largely not be the case. For the simple reason that you would get the approval. But this breaks down because in reality, you often don't get the approval that the superego has promised you. It's all been for nothing. And this can be for a multiplicity of reasons we don't need to look at. You just don't get it from parents, extended family. They've always got a fucking favorite. It's your cousin who's smarter, better looking, or whatever, right? You know, right from the off, you can start falling foul, let alone when you go on TikTok and OnlyFans and go out into the world, right? You may not be the best worker. You may not get the prize. You may not be accepted. So suddenly you realize, what the hell is, well, you don't realize, but in a better world, you realize I'm giving this game up, but you don't. So there's a tremendous drain of energy. But then on top of this, there's sensual fallout. This is a part that very few people ever add. By the time you're in your late 20s or and early 30s, you're already exhausted with the glutting yourself in the sensational world, because the sensational world does not go on forever. In fact, even nowadays, by the time you're a late teen, you're already done with the boozing, the drinking, the whoring, and the drugging. Right? You've gone around. The faster the society moves, you see, the more the extrovert person who's been seeking for meaning from without finds out that it's starting to pale. It's starting to thin out. He doesn't plan this. He thinks that, you know, in the early days, you're fooled into thinking it's a Aladdin's cave, just non-stop of pleasure. You know, it's a pleasure dome. Guess what? By your at the very latest, right, in your mid-30s, you start to have this amazing withdrawal syndrome come along, which shows you that, no, you made a bargain with the devil. The world is not 100% satiating you. You keep pulling the lever and fuck all's coming out because you've done it all. That's why you get these, women now, they reach about 35 years old and they're screaming. They're gaining weight. They look back at their empty lives of just pure hedonism, unadulterated hedonism, right? The champagne cocktails, the partying, the raves, all of it. And they're empty. They've had all the riches, the 3-car garages full of stuff, the shoes, the bags, right? Man is not much better. And they find out to their horror that the devil is grinning from ear to ear. Yeah. So then what do? Now there is a fallout so severe that they turn toward that world that they absolutely love and cherish and start screaming blue murder. You know where these millennials today and these hipsters, they're so entitled, but they also have a lot of this rage buried deep inside. This is where this is coming from. The happy discontent originally was in a puff of pleasure, grinning from ear to ear. But now that's slowly being contaminated by another emotion, and that's deep rage against the very system that they'd love to be part of, because they found out to their amazement that they're sensually glutted. And that breeds exhaustion as they keep on looking for more and more sensual pleasure to get more and more exhausted. But as I've already told you, the psyche in them is already exhausted. And so the defenses start to come down, the rage and the shame go up. And now you're in what you've got. This all adds up. I'm being short about this, but this all adds up to the kind of state that you get today with grossly overweight people screaming at the world as if there's something wrong with the world. They're screaming at Big Brother, but what they're really saying when you translate it, when you put the universal translator, give me more, it comes out as save the minorities, more equity. That's what you think you're hearing. And all the slogans that they love. Women's rights. What did you say?
I said, let in more illegals, you know. Isn't that the solution to our problem?
That's what it sounds like on the surface because they have to window dress it. Man is a creature of self-deception. But when you
Yeah, yeah.
scrape all of that away, because they don't give a monkeys about any of that,
Tax the
what
rich.
they care about is how dare the world run out of distraction and sweets.
Yeah.
I made a commitment with myself when I was younger, you see, to go mad, to be lost in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. How dare you tell me that there's no more flavors? Yeah,
The chocolate
a
river run
great.
dry. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
a
yeah.
great deal of what you see today, we call this article "Happy Discontents." This is what's going on. They're not unhappy discontents to that degree that they found out that there's a law that cannot be changed. So what do? You bang on the doors of big government going, you are at fault. I'm going to vote for Bernie Sanders and other people who believe me. You need to produce more stuff. And the government's going, we're working on it. Can't you see we're sweating? Look, we got AI. Please be at peace. It's coming. We got more stuff for you. And they go, yeah, but when? I'm banging my spoon now. I want more now. I can't live. I don't want the same tawdry old stuff. They go, no, we're going to give you more virtual reality. Yeah, but when? Take away this anxiety now. But of course, there's some smart engineers out there, social architects who go, well, we need to cover this discontent up with a lot of social causes. Keep window dressing it. Keep putting up your politicians and your social leaders talking about, I don't know, climate change. Will that work? I don't think so. No, give it a go. Let's see if it works. Fuck me, does it work? Save some pigeons. Save some fish. Save some this. Save, all this. Do you think these people really care about the planet? Have you seen the state of it? Right? So this thing doesn't fool anyone with insight. But the tension within these people has grown so deep, although they've got a mask on top that's lowered guilt, and that gives them a certain high. It's a very, very paltry high. Underneath it is a rage of how can it be that the world's sensational pleasures are finite? I was promised eternal distraction. Are you telling me I've got to bring meaning from within or something? Well, they can't do that and never would be able to do that. We talked about misosophy before, right? They're deeply misosophic. They cannot do it. They hate the wise. They hate wisdom. They get into the crowd as a kind of an amplification because your own neurosis is amplified by others. So you get a high out of that. This has all been shown to be the case, but we're trying to, break it down here to show, and that caption that you read just totally, I think, works there. And never forget that this super ego's main job is to adjust you to the crowd, to get you to lower anxiety. And the very fact that you're focusing your attention on social causes also helps reduce anxiety, by the way. It's called monodiasm. You focus and you narrow, because the more and more that your consciousness is awakened, in the wider way, the more anxiety that it breeds, the more legitimate suffering it breeds. So these people throwing the cause in front of them, or in other words, what we're talking about here is the political movement, helps to narrow the focus to exclude other concerns. And the biggest concern is about yourself. You cannot face yourself. But when my concern for myself is obliterated and I'm only focusing on some abstractia or on some future utopia, there's actually a strange temporary lowering of anxiety. So all of this needs to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, you're really hitting the nail on the head. And just to make sure everybody's sort of following along with us, we've spoken a little bit about Freud, how he's been misinterpreted. And we spoke about one of his last books there, Civilization is Discontents. And there's been this theme so far about these people who we call the discontents or the smiling depressives as they're described as well also. This comes through, people are civilized, which occurs through this repression of instinct, which comes from the superego, which as we covered last time, it sort of looks out into the world and looks out for heroic figures to emulate, but it ends up internalizing sort of, maybe some tyrannical sort of voices off the parents or off society. This then leads to a repression of their true self with it. And that helps them to follow along with the voice of the superego, because the superego, whenever they don't obey it, that evokes this guilt, as we've been discussing so far. But as we've sort of touched on, whenever we listen to the superego, whenever we get rid of the guilt, we're repressing more of our true self. And that's where this self-hatred then arises on the other side of it. And you describe that as autophobia beforehand as well too, which is, I guess, is what we're discussing. And you go on in the article to say The person who hates himself for following society's rules soon comes to despise society itself, and that the people that hate themselves are easy to manipulate. So this leads right into what we're talking about, the architects of control, and how these people are then easier to manipulate. How else do they use people's self-hatred to work towards their own agenda?
Well, this, of course, is something that they can't believe because it's free as far as this is concerned. The society that has frustrated you by not having eternal pleasure. See, one thing we got to twig, man is not seeking for truth or for wisdom. He's seeking for constant sensual gratification. His neurosis, therefore, or this crowd that we're talking about, let's get it clear. They're not sweating because of any real injustices. How could they be? They've done the greatest injustice that you can conceive of to themselves. Why am I trying to save somebody out in fucking Somalia or wherever they think,
Yeah.
right? When you've
Gaza.
already, murdered
Gaza,
yourself.
that's
This
it,
is the
isn't it?
autophobia.
Isn't that it? Yeah.
So this is the twisted logic, right? But having bought into this nonsense, you're committed to it forever. And you can't get away so easily because, of course, of this amplification of the crowd. And it directs you. You're directed, you're taken over. And this is what's known as hysteria. You're not only neurotic, you're hysterical because the crowd whips up the frenzy. And that ends up, carrying you along. So Big Brother knows this is all free. This is brilliant because even if you wake up, there's 500 other people to replace you. Yeah. Even when some of these millennials go older, they kind of leave this left-wing wokeism. They do. But it makes no dent because there's another bunch of clueless teenagers to fill their slots. And you can't tell them, hey, wake up. They go, but you had the sensual pleasure. It's my turn now. They go, it's easy for you to talk, but you had all those gimmicks and all of that entertainment. I never did. Get out of my way. Talk to me later, maybe. See? So you can't, it's like somebody standing outside a banquet looking through the window. Nothing you say is going to work because they're going to say, but you're inside and I'm outside. You've no right to tell me. You've already dined on it. See, so there's no resentment, even if you're really one of a kind. They're going to resent you because you already had a feast that they've never had. And you'll find that your words of logic goes, look, I was one of you. I was one of you. And I've woken up to go, I don't care about that. Get out of our way. We don't listen to you. Your words mean nothing. It's easy for you to say, but because you've had all of that stuff already, we haven't. We're deprived. You see how it works? So once you're led by the nose in this direction, then there can never be any healing. But the trouble is that Big Pharma has been born out of this because Big Pharma is there to help you take away the neurotic misery, so to speak, but with it goes the legitimate suffering that makes you human. The governments of the world, they're part of it, right? All of these different things have come in. These great leviathans are all, you can understand their origin now. And of course, this has even happened in the universities, what have you, right? Now, the people at the top know everything that I'm talking about. That's why I know that there's remedies here. Otherwise, I'd have shut up long ago and disappeared because you don't have much of an audience listening to this. But I know that the ones who do listen to it, the few people, will get great secrets out of this to help them in their own personal lives, but also to help them when they are maybe going to interact, in society and go on X or go on Instagram or go out there with some knowledge. This is the knowledge to have. If you're going to do it, if you do feel a conscience, a social conscience, and you want to be a writer or a journalist or whatever, or a writer or even a public speaker, then at least know the right kind of direction. Have your story together. Don't just fall for the normal political cliches and the platitudes. Don't just follow the headlines. There's a whole world of knowledge.
Yeah.
And learn about the human psyche and what it does in this immersion that we're talking about, this immersion in the crowd and where it comes from.
Yeah. So it's this self-hatred that comes up, and they go, well, how do we get rid of it? What are the techniques for dealing with it? And obviously, these architects of control know those different ways of it. The bread and circuses being one element of that. But you also wrote about in the article about displacement and about regression. And there's this regression into what Otto Rank, I believe you've done quite a lot of work on, describes as a surrogate womb, which is also sort of maybe a metaphor for what the crowd is, which is one of the main themes that we've been coming on so far. What's the link between that? Maybe if you want to just say a little bit more about the surrogate wound and how people, try to lose themselves within it.
Very important.
Mm,
Probably in its own way, it's one of the most important things because
mm,
this is because everything we've been talking about has been super ego based.
yeah,
Most of
yeah,
what we've done is analyze the functions of the super ego. It's all very valuable. Somebody may still say, yeah, you've given me about 3/4 of insight into what's going on in the world, but I still feel there's stuff left over that's not quite fitting the theory. And they'd be right. This is because when you look around and you see a lot of this weird feral behavior, these kind of slut walks, these kind of gay parades,
dressing up as babies and being on a leash and all this
all of
kind of
that caper,
nonsense.
right? Yes, which is fairly new. And all of this other sort of rule breaking, the way there's more cursing now, more foul language amongst the left, their weird dress, this uncivil, they're calling it the lack of civility is now it's being called, right? We thought that the superego was all about rules and regulations and standards. Yet now we're seeing a lot of bloated stuff that doesn't look in the slightest bit. So, Michael, your theories don't fit. We're seeing a lot of this libertine behavior. In fact, it's almost characteristic of the woke on the left. Look at this Chaz, look at the burnings, look at the destruction of beautiful artwork, pulling down of statues, and just this feral behavior. I don't see how you can be linking this to Freud's superego. You've got a screw loose. Something's missing. And they'd be right. But here's the weird thing that, again, people who've turned over 2 pages at once don't get. One of the great, and you just put your finger on it right now, one of the great solutions to all these problems that face a person who's been under superego control, and it seems obvious when you say it, but it's not obvious when you don't. And that is, why don't I emotionally and mentally regress to the period before the superego came into being, before its advent? You had 7 years of it. Wait a minute. What? Yes. There's a period what Freud called the polymorphous perverse period. The period where gratification is not delayed. The period where the reality principle has not really fully become installed. And you're under what's known as the pleasure principle. Look it up. The pleasure principle. I can literally decide on some subconscious or non-conscious level to regress, you mentioned the word, right? Back. This is the ultimate regression, of course, right? And it means not regressing in terms of historical time to some, primitive world, not progressing to a utopian communitarian world. Those are 2 things we talked about, or other distractions. No. This is just your purely personal, ontological, psychological regression that every psychologist knows about. In your own individual life, you just go, reality, you're too much. All of this started when I had to delay gratification. I don't like that. All of this happened when the reality principle intruded into this beautiful prenatal, state, this embryonic state. I'm going back there. In fact, you have whole cults of it. They're called the cult of non-dualism, or this New Age movement, or following these Eastern paths when they talk about nirvana. Not 1 in a million people even know what that's all about. It's another womb metaphor. Or I follow some other boogaloo thing, like taking ayahuasca down in the jungle. Do you know what the jungle represents? Do you know what equatorial countries represent symbolically? No. Yeah. It's this regression, right? Going back to the earlier roots of society. You can watch a movie called Altered States. It will tell you all about it. Now, this regression has happened already. And the weight gain is one of the clear signs of this, because there's no delayed gratification anymore. It was just pig out. So immediately you see the waist sizes, expanding. But more than that is what I just addressed a few minutes ago about the feral behavior, this unbridled cursing, rolling around, lying about naked in the streets, riding your bicycles naked, squealing, screaming, skinning rats. Occasionally it even becomes more criminal and violent. But you know what I mean, right? Just the normal, letting the hair down, raging, these ones that did it, where you had them screaming at the sky, or we call Trump derangement syndrome. This is what I'm talking about. You're actually able to go back to an infantile state. This is the infantilization or the feminization of the entire planet, where the superego is there, but it's a structure that only really comes into being solid at around 6 and 7 years old. Well, that leaves you a long period of time before it got developed. And this is the key to your question. People can actually regress. They're all around us. They all surround us now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Just as you're saying it, this phrase infantilization, I immediately think of communism, and I immediately think
Mhm.
of how they want the state to provide everything for them. They want big daddy government, or the nanny
There you go.
state is the new phrase off it as well. Also, if there's anything
That's it.
going wrong, you've got to fix it for me. If there's anything going wrong, make sure you punish all the bad guys with it, and you tell me what to believe. That's fine. We're all part of a group. This is exactly how these people think. We're really just sort of getting into those. Yeah, we're speaking about this influx of self hatred, which is coming from over listening to a tyrannical superego. And we spoke a little bit of how people want to regress and be a part of the crowd, and this is a metaphor, this surrogate womb thing. Explain a little bit more about how this ties in with the religious type. And there's a little bit you wrote about in the article, which people can go and read more of themselves. And we speak about the New Age movement, and you talk about auto hypnosis as being one of the tricks of the tools there. But even let's broaden this out into the wider religion, maybe sort of more applicable to people, sort of Christianity and those kind of things as well too.
Well, this plays an enormous role as well because this regression is also to be understood as a kind of symbiosis, right? A returning to a paradisical condition. So when we project the womb metaphor out to the future, it becomes utopia, which is a dream that people have, of a perfect society in which man lives in harmony. But this projection, it is a projection of something that actually exists backwards in our own personal, private life. Whether this was the condition of mankind, that's mostly metaphor, right? We don't even really know. But you can think of it that way too. Anthropologically, when man was closer to nature, when he lived amongst an animal, pretty much as an animal, that works. That's okay if you want. But really, on a psychological level, that holds less weight. What holds weight is this prenatal period. Because, if you want everything rooted in empirical fact, then you have to stick to this. What we're talking about is not pie in the sky. It is actual experience of the human fetus in the womb, where the parents provide everything that is needed, including the security, the warmth, the food, the comfort, right, and all the rest of it. And also, there's no challenges anymore. You've got the two that are going to handle it. And this goes on for about, 7 years, really, at the end of the day, right? Of course, the child is maturing and it has to do a lot of things like potty training and all this. There's a certain amount of control that's required. But at the end of the day, this parental control carries on past 5 years old, 6, 7, and all this. And if mothers had their way, you'd never get free. They'd be in control of you until you were an adult person. We know this. It's the father who usually wants to, introduce you to the world and the reality principle a lot sooner and so on. But without even getting into all of that, the child hankers all through its life for the return of this paradisical state and for this, what can only be called as incestuous symbiosis. It's not sexual incest, but it's emotional incest. The idea that you came out of this place that was warm and friendly and nurturing and you want it again, this symbiosis. And so, since you can't have it again, Otto Rank, Julia Kristeva, Barbara Creed, some of these psychologists said, especially Otto Rank, was of the opinion that then the most dominant instinct in your life, if you have to talk about these bloody things called instincts, then the most dominant instinct is to go find it in surrogate form later on. Now, you asked about religion. He would then, in a similar way to Freud, but he built it out a bit better, he would say that your religious orders, your religious questing, this is what this is born out of. And religion works because it provides this surrogate womb paradisical slash, paradisical state after life is over. You see? And so the soul that is forced into the solar world, let's call it, the patriarchal world, so called, might, as we've already said, they're discontents. So what happens is they enter the world, but they enter the world for its perks. They enter the world for its relative pleasure. And they also enter the world because there's they're trying to escape from a Stygian world in which the rule of the terrible mother. Remember, we've talked about that in previous. So there's that. But at the end of the day, the solar world is liked for its attributes, but it's not really loved for itself. So what you're getting is a lot of sort of vagabonds. You're getting a lot of visitors. You're getting a lot of strays who are only going in like you would go in and maybe to a bus shelter out of the rain for 5 minutes, right? You're not really concerned about anything in it. It's just a temporary haven, a temporary refuge. You see? So this is one major, major problem that I try to bring out. But the religion comes in because now it is offering the grown-up person the promise of this future paradise in which you will be able to be taken care of by the great parent in the sky. This time it's God, you see? In which all of these creature comforts and this happiness that you've been denied through your life. And also, if bad things have happened to you, there'll be a reward. Oh, yeah. And of course, the biggest reward of all, eternal life and eternal pleasure in heaven. All of this stuff, right? So that's where religion would come in. And it's all based in projecting the prenatal condition. Now, Rank goes on to say that your dream life, your nighttime life, is also a womb metaphor. So he had a theory that when you dream, and people who need excessive time to sleep, this is all because of this. There's a need to return to the womb, and that even your dream life is somehow replaying or recalling. Well, of course, it's fantasy. Key to the dream life, key to the fantasy world. Sorry, key to the world we're talking about is fantasy, where anything can be anything you want. Right? That's why you have your future utopias. It'll be anything one of these utopians tells you he thinks it needs to be. The future is an open thing that doesn't push back, doesn't fight back. You can project into it anything you want. You see? So Rank was onto this. He says, all born out of self-deception. And then he said something that really fascinated me more than anything else. He said that the very unconscious, that is the very subject matter of psychoanalysis, is itself a womb metaphor. Yeah, nobody had ever touched on this before, right? He went from the dream state in primitive people who did, sleep more, and their own sleep was a mystery to them because they had these dreams and all of that. He has a whole case that he makes out of this. But he also then ended up by saying that the very thing that psychologists call the unconscious is a womb metaphor for the very fact that you can say anything you want about it is true. This was his way of critiquing Freud and critiquing all the other models. He says, my God, you can have Jung, you can have Adler, you can have Freud, you can have any theory about the unconscious is fits. The unconscious, like the conscious, can be anything you want it to be. It never speaks of itself except in metaphor. You and I have talked about this before. Why, when the mind wants to speak about itself, it inevitably starts using metaphors. It's like something else. But I don't want to know what you're like. I want to know what you are. But this is where it all becomes very slippery. The mind refuses or doesn't know how to speak of itself in the direct denotative manner. It slides off into comparisons and metaphors and similes. But has anybody ever stopped to say, why? I don't want to know what you're like. I want to know what you are. Well, guess what? Materialists can't answer this. The materialist has no answer for this. Yeah, he just explains it away. So then you see, if you follow that thread, then the next thing to think about is that this may then carry on. Let's carry on with that. You find out that the mind then can say anything about itself that it wants to. Consciousness or the unconscious can be anything you want it to be. And this then told Otto Rank, when a client comes in to see Freud, they lie down in a darkened room on a sofa, right, on a couch, close their eyes often, or they're just staring up into space, and they start talking about their childhood. He was a genius, and he saw this whole thing from a different angle. He said, what is actually happening here? Why are you even lying down in a darkened room? What does this simulate? Oh, and I'm talking about my dreams? So Rank's books were totally off the wall. He's not a Freudian in that sense, because he even wrote a book called Beyond Psychology. The title says it all. He was looking at the thing from the widest perspective you can imagine. What is this phenomena? Why did it even get created? What is man doing to himself when he signs on for this? It's not that the doctors know any better. They're part of it. They're part of some other weird. In other words, the doctor, the therapist is participating in some sort of delusional game that both parties are playing, and he couldn't stop looking at it in this way. Now, this is not to say that he was worrying about that it maybe isn't helping somebody on another level, right? He wasn't much more philosophical about the whole thing. On a practical level, okay, we're not looking at why that is. People have these neurotic things they need to clear up. It might be helping them. He's not looking at it from that point of view. He's just looking at the thing phenomenologically. What the hell is going on? Where did we, and then the closest parallel, he thought, and this goes back to your earlier question about religion. The closest we got to this is you going to the confessional, sitting in a dark box with a guy speaking to you through a hole in the wall that you can't even see him. He's dressed in black. He represents a disembodied voice, the voice of God, the voice of your conscience, or whatever it's meant to be, a parallel of. You go in there, you're embryonically shut off, right? You're in an incubated box in a holy place, which represents the womb. All inside of churches would represent the womb, you see. And then you go inside even a smaller cubicle, and then you speak about your most personal, in this case, sins, but whatever, right? You're talking about your unconscious fantasies. On the psychiatrist couch, you're speaking about your unconscious fantasies. So this Otto Rank is not an ordinary thinker, right? Most people don't even read him or understand him because he's like, what the hell is this? But his first book was called The Trauma of Birth. This is when he broke away from Freud, you see. And it was all his later work was sort of hinged on this. That, wait a minute, there's something happening in this original prenatal condition that has this paradisical, or what Erich Newman later on would call, this Euroboric, paradisical condition of feeling of omnipotence, whatever. And in it, yes, there's the vague feeling of a goddess figure, a matriarch. Certainly you have that. You have the All-Father image eventually coming on, but much later. And everything. You do have these figures appearing. And that's why sometimes in the womb metaphor, you also have it too. In the heaven and hell thing, you have, the father figure, don't you? In the utopia, you might have a world leader, like a sort of a Klaus Schwab type potentate. Yeah, it's all there, right? Or if it's not a figure, then it'll be some cosmic ideal. Science, but the classic ones, you see? A cityscape. In the article, I talk about all these different metaphors for it. And in the unconscious, you have the concept of the self or the ego, right? There's many ways to look at this. A central figure. Rank would look at Jung and go, yeah, he's got all those things he calls archetypes. I can explain that. These are characters within the unconscious that sort of replicate some of the factors of this Euroboric condition, this state of being. I just think he has a case.
Yeah, as we've sort of spoken quite a bit about it, we've also spoken a little bit about the role of the father and about how the role of the father can be in breaking away of or breaking through the superego's control. And it reminds me of like most past civilizations or sort of more primitive people. They would have these different rites of passage for young men and people to go through in order to break away from this sort of control of the superego. Have you any thoughts about those on sort of the rites of passage and how those are missing or how that sort of ties in? I guess this is definitely one of the things that the architects of control try to use. Get rid of that, separate fathers from the home, and extends this period of being under superego control, I guess.
Yes, it definitely does from a typological point of view. So we can't go into every detail about every individual case of a father.
Of course.
There's sometimes when the father is not needed. But no, you're talking about psychology and typology, then this changes. The coach is needed. The father figure is needed because his archetypal value is in helping. Remember we said when the regression starts to go back before 7, some of the things that are involved in that are a return to a state in which there's polymorphous perversity, there's no delayed gratification, there's no reality principle and all this. The father figure is the one who is to install in the child the reality principle. Which when you unpack that, it just simply means he's the one who brings you the world. The mother is your world up until that point, but that can be a force that kind of insulates you against reality. And most times it is. The father, though, is the one who traditionally was out in the world. He was bringing the meat back. He was killing the animals. He was warding off the enemies. And so he represents the heroic archetype that kind of has mastery over the world. He went fishing. He took the boat out onto the high seas. Think of the Vikings, right? Think of the Eskimos going out there to hunt whales and all of this kind of thing, right? So in every sense, the woman is unheroic and the male was heroic. So his role is to slowly be there so that when you're about 6, 7 years old, maybe after potty training, but even the mother's in control of that. No, he's there mostly to introduce you to how he's a superego representative, but he represents this voice that says, he represents the guilt factor. Listen, there's a price that you'll have to pay if you don't go along with society's, right? Not morals, but modes, standards, norms. Yeah. And he sort of introduces you to that and sort of steadies the way. Because remember, his voice is going to be interjected as the superego. So he's there to sort of adjust you to the baseline of what it means to be a citizen of the civilized society. But the more evolved father, his role is a bit different. He doesn't want you to be a conformist. He wants you to enter into the solar world as a lover of the solar world, but he wants you to be an individual. This would mean that your father was an alpha type who's not going to just say, go there and be a hedonist. Go there and think of the world as endlessly turning you on. In other words, that you're just some passive recipient of nothing but pleasure from morning to night. He's going to be the one that says, you must enter the world of the solar and also be a contributor. You have to bring some sort of skill or meaning from within. Yeah, not just be a passive receiver type. If you're under the care of the mother, this is all you're ever going to be. And that's what most people are. They're always passive. They're always receivers. And then I said, when it looks like they're being active, no, they're not active. They're just banging their spoon. They've got aggressive now, but that aggression is not born out of a genuine reason for equality and fairness and justice. It's because they want more goodies and you're not providing it. They've sucked the tit dry. Yeah, these passive types. And now they get into a crowd of other delinquents like themselves, the thugocracy, and start screaming for reform. But what that underneath it means, more cosmetics, more magazines, more fun, more distraction, more sitcoms, more soap operas, more beaches, more champagne, more cushions. And we want it now. And if you don't give it to us now, we're going to go fucking mad. We're going to be hysterics. We'll tear something to pieces. And big government is completely complicit and goes, hell, we love the crowd. We're busy. Don't you worry. We're having implants. Tomorrow, it'll be, what do they say? All anxieties tranquilized. So don't get fooled. But the archetypal father figure that you're speaking about doesn't want any of this. He doesn't want his son or daughter to just enter into the world of lower guilt. He doesn't want the child that he raises to be a fucking obedience worker and to get 3 stripes. He wants him to listen to the voice of the conscience. But we have feminized that man out of existence. He no longer exists. The woman won't allow him to exist. The feminized man, the chivalric man, has annihilated him. He's got nothing to say to his children. He's circulating around the will of the terrible mother. He's what I call the chivalric man or the terrible man, right? He's just an acolyte. He's Mordred around Morgan Le Fay. He's totally and then he helps to breed the betas, who are the ones we just talked about, the happy discontents.
Yeah.
And so our world is more and more falling under the control of beta men, and feminized women.
The last man.
Yeah, and also the terrible women, the terrible mothers.
Yeah.
It's different flavors, different versions of the same thing.
Yeah. We've covered quite a lot of ground again here today, and I think we've really went deeper into the psyche, and we went sort of more into its perversions of what's happening in the modern world, especially with these discontent types that we've been discussing. Is there anything you think we haven't went over so far that you'd like to go into, or maybe a note to wrap up upon? Or I can read a little bit from the article if you want me to call that up once more.
Why don't you do that? Read something else.
Yeah. I think down at the end of the article might be, let me just share it. Might be on something on Ayn Rand. I think Ayn Rand. Let me see. Yeah, I'll maybe just read this last bit, Michael, and then I'll pass it over to you. Yeah, super. So yeah, just
Okay.
to wrap up the end of our show here, I'll discuss a little bit more at the end of the article, which people can find, and we'll leave a link to down below. And so, as you write here, Michael, in philosophy, who needs it? Ayn Rand gives a brilliant account of the Woodstock Festival of 1969. She explains the bizarre antics of its attendees, the Dionysian types, who abjured the use of reason. Like Huxley, Orwell, and others, Rand warned America of the dangers lying in wait, the traps set by ardent collectivists and those attempting to dismantle Western civilization. Those whose efforts to obtain happiness come to naught in later years still find consolation in the pleasure of chronic intoxication, or else they embark upon that despairing attempt at revolt, as Sigmund Freud writes. And just as in your own words at the end, the word utopia, the word utopia actually means no place. I trust that in this short article I've made it clear where the term truly donates. Utopia undoubtedly serves as the ultimate womb metaphor, standing for a future every discontent seeks to inhabit, come what may. The ticket is already in hand, and there's no other route marked on the map. As the anarchic discontents disappear among the mushrooms, you'll hear their chant echo abroad and float up to the clouds. We're heading to Eden. Yea, brother, I am everyone. Everyone is me. Hail Dionysus, Lord of Love, intoxication, and oblivion.
Yeah. It's the gods themselves, you see. Now, the father figure that you spoke about is to try and save you from that. It doesn't mean that he's antagonistic to what was before. He just knows that was his place in the chronology, in the psychosexual chronology. But he's there as a wayshore. That's why in mythology you have your Merlin for your King Arthur. You have your other sages who are coaches, in that tradition. And we need them. You do need that steadying hand. You need the old wise man archetype. And there's a time for the mother archetype. It's all natural. Nature has ordained this, so there's nothing wrong with it. But by the time you get to the masculine solar world, it has its own initiations. If you don't have these correctly, then you might find yourself falling for these regressive concepts. The bad ones of religion that we mentioned, they can become very seductive to the feminine side of you. The Orwellian idea of a future utopia, which is really a dystopia, can become seductive. And see, once you've fallen under these, as we know, look at the average religious type. They're fanatics. You can't talk to those people. And you can't talk to these utopians. They're not going to listen to you. This thing has become a bedfellow. This thing is lowering their anxiety. This thing is a promise. You see, you can't seduce them away. They need it like a drug. And also some very, very powerful forces are aware of its power, and they have designed their cities, they've designed their communities, and a lot of the memes that are going around embody this or embody these ideas of a future, which again, as we know, can be anything you want it to be. But this is very, very seductive. And because they've not listened to their Freuds or any of these Freudians, they don't know even what regression is. How could you spot something? It could be right in front of your eyes, but you won't know it. You're not able to diagnose it. So people have even come out of Harvard. Some of the people, that write these books, these Terence McKenna types, these Timothy Leary types, these are very intelligent people. They get on Joe Rogan and everything, start talking. Yeah. A lot of these people who are transhumanists. We talked about, how the unconscious itself can be seen as a womb metaphor. But the way that the neurologist is talking, some of the new theories that come up about the supercomputer, the organic brain. You see, this thing takes on many, many permutations. There's people working on it right now who have no idea that their theories of the global brain, and the organic computer, these guys coming out of MIT, are all under thrall because they haven't bothered reading these mighty souls, these great geniuses of the past, or they've only flicked through it, or they've listened to the shrink-wrap version that's left out more. Why do you think I started this with the critiques of what they did to Freud? Because you see, all of these teachings have been shrink-wrapped for American audiences. Things have been left out, right, rather than put in. So if you pick up a book or you go on the internet or whatever, you're not going to get the whole story. They've left out so much. Bruno Bettelheim will walk you through it, what they've done to Freud. Yeah. There's so many things to know. And somebody had to step in, and try to fill in some of these blanks. We were only touching on certain things. But It's very, very important to know about the womb, the metaphor, and how that is carried around in our heads. We go there every night. Sleep and dream is nothing but a return, a temporary return. Right? The energies fade and return back inside into the inner space. And we need this. And unfortunately, when you're not aware, it's also these desires can be played out in the 3D world, done so subtly that we don't realize it. That's why I say the self deception is at the heart of everything, right? Because we don't allow ourselves to know what we're doing. Now, the alpha male, the wise man, he lets you know what's going on. If you're going to stop a thing, if you're going to stop doing it, you've got to know why it's happening in the first place. And then when you see what it is, you go, maybe I want to put that down. Maybe I don't want that. You only get back to reality by looking at the unreality. That's what the subtitle of the article is. And when you see that this is a house of cards, it's not good for you. It's not good for society, right? We're not going to listen to the World Economic Forum. We're not going to listen to Bono and these other morons, these champagne socialists who bought into all of this. I'm not going to delude myself on that. Now, this doesn't mean that I don't work towards helping society or overcoming certain injustices. No, that can carry on. But I'm not going to be seduced into losing my selfhood. I'm not going to, I'm not going to become obsessed with the voice of the superego, which helps me just lower guilt while my inner self is raging. And ultimately speaking, you want to be able to then, once all of the negatives are pulled away, you want to get to a more concrete understanding of what is the self. Does it even exist in the way that we think? Or is it too a model, a metaphor, an illusion? You see? But you can't even get to those deeper philosophical questions with all of this pruck in the way. You see? Yeah. The truth may be actually quite simple, but we're never going to get to it when all of these veils and all of this bric-a-brac of illusion is surrounding us. That's unrealistic. You won't have the mental space, you see, to be able to contemplate it because it's just damage control all the way. And that's where we're at.
Yeah.
If we're just being juggled, between two polarities of either the anxiety, the guilt and the shame, which are
Mm,
really just two forms of anxiety, right? If we're
mm,
de-energized bioenergetically because there's so much wastage of energy as the superego, which is nothing but a mass of defenses, is doing this, that, and the other, all these things we've talked about, where's the bioenergy to be penetrating the mysteries, right? Don't you need, it's a physical, chemical fact that you need energy to do anything. It's the most empirical fact. I need the energy. How can you have the energy if it's been bled off
mm.
into all these inauthentic directions, right? Wouldn't they all have to be turned off first so that there's this extreme concentration of bioenergy so then I can focus my attention on the greater questions of life? They may demand that. They actually do demand that because I'm piercing through illusion. The Eastern world is filled with illusion, right? The West is just knee deep in illusion. How am I going to have the energy? I'll be exhausted. And don't forget, a lot of what I'm saying doesn't mean that you shouldn't have pleasure. I didn't say that. But I said, watch what pleasure does to you. Watch what, if you go towards it with too much gusto and you have too much of an entitlement, just like these millennials and the woke do today, their entitlement is coming from a certain place because of a delusion that the world will be there to satisfy. That can only happen in a person who's already disowned the self. Because now if they believe that the only meaning they ever know is given to them by the world, do you know what kind of a creature you have? You've got a hyper extroverted, hysteric, or you get the fallout from that. Because as I said, at a given age, it depends on each individual, when they realize, one, that meaning doesn't come from without, two, that the sensational pleasures of the world are going to be waning, obviously there's fallouts. Right? And in another program, we might even talk about that. You got your obsessive compulsive, you got your depressive, and you got your schizoid, and your hysteric. But these are conditions that when you don't get what you want, there's these fallout positions that need to be analyzed. Maybe next time we can do that. You see, so this breeds, this is more incredible. We won't go into it now. We'll leave that for the next time. But there are also these other fallout positions. Or next time we can even go into more of analyze the religious side of things. What's going on there? Because don't forget, just because I've critiqued religion from one angle, that doesn't mean that there isn't spirit. That doesn't mean that there isn't something higher. See, but first of all, you'd have to deconstruct all the falsity, get that all out of the way before you can even be ready to look at the thing cleanly. If you don't, then it's always going to be contaminated by these lower desires and these idiotic norms. Remember, you already interjected two of the most powerful imagos that you can have in there called the parents. You already interjected a father image, a father figure, and a mother figure. You might be already somebody who's in the process of regressing back to when the mother had supreme control. So is that the reason why a lot of people are into the New Age movement? Is that why a lot of people believe in the goddess tradition? They know nothing about the authentic tradition, but they believe in it as presented by a media because they themselves are regressive types who want to go back to the lunar world. Then I don't give a toss about your stupid beliefs. In fact, I actually find this out to be true. Yeah. And if you're a regressive type, then is that why these third world lunatics, why you got their pictures on your refrigerator and over your wall, these mud races? You think that their teachings, these are people who are deeply regressed, right? Who want nothing to do with the reality principle. They don't even know there is such a thing. They come into the West to tell you how to live, trying to satiate some sort of desire within you, the discontents, the people who just find reality too hard to handle. And that's because the father wasn't there to introduce them to it properly. You're being, like Robert Blythe, you mentioned his book, Iron John, last time. The father figure is not there to introduce you to the positives of the solar world and also show you your true place in it. So that when you're contributing to it and seeing the result, you will want to be part of it and you'll enjoy it. And you won't see its failings as mistakes. You'll see them as challenges that need to be remedied and fixed. Yeah. In other words, you won't be one of these discontents who occupies the solar world, but internally is filled with, this desire for oblivion. And don't you know, in religion too, just to speak about that, don't they have their apocalypse vision? Don't they have their rapture? See, all of these things to be understood. Rapture is not even in the Bible, but they added it on later. But don't they have their apocalypse idea? Where did that all come from? They're always telling us it's going to happen, and it never does. Where did the idea of apocalypse even come from? And is it healthy? So there's many, many questions, but only when you get to the psychological underpinnings of it, that these early natal and prenatal periods were immensely seductive, immensely. And they carry in our minds and have a great deal of reason why people do the things that they do and live the way they live.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. I guess this episode really goes a lot more into the detail of what we built on last time, where we spoke about misosophy and we spoke about how there's this kernel of hatred of wisdom, which is sort of encapsulated by this self-deception that sort of surrounds it. And I guess we've really went into where that comes from. And it's the self-hatred is one of these protective layers that people don't want to go near. They don't want to do the legitimate suffering that's needed, as part of the shadow work, which is the positive aspect of what we were speaking about, of how to actually progress. But yeah, we'll go deeper into this into the next episode. I think we've got plenty for. Oh yeah.
One thing
Any
I
last
forgot,
words? Yeah.
just one quick thing about
Mm-hmm.
in this stage of the prenatal and the natal, there's no sexuality. The boy is not aware he's a boy, and the girl is not aware he's a girl. That stuff doesn't even come until the genital phase, which is almost like 1 or 2 phases before the end of the Oedipal system. It's towards the end. So don't you see that today in this transsexual world, that's replicated? One of the signs of aggression is not only the feralness and the libertinism, but suddenly this focus on the sexual pronouns. Because again, in the regress period, there is no sex to speak of. That comes later as you approach the reality principle. Well, the regressive type is clearly not going to give
Yeah.
a damn about that and is going to be confused about their sexuality. That's exactly what you're getting. Yeah. So just another thing to throw in there.
We'll maybe even break it down one time. I think we'll keep building on psychology and then we'll turn that to different people within society and break it in different aspects. So I'm just thinking
Mhm.
into this whole tranny thing that we're speaking of. We talk about the sort of the superego, you listen to it, it pushes down the authentic self. There's this overwhelming of self-hatred. Then you try to escape into the crowd to distance yourself from it. There's this regression that occurs. And then we spoke last time a little bit about the archetypes. We didn't speak about, possession, because I see a lot of this as like, this is the self coming back in. This is the anima or the animus possessing these people. And then they identify with this feminine characteristic or this masculine characteristic within themselves. But even just going into the depths of the self-hatred that they try to get out from. And then the medical industry goes, here's how to mutilate yourself and inject drugs into yourself, to damage you for the rest of your life. That's your better solution to get rid of your self-hatred. You were born in the wrong body. What a sick lie that is, like people are being taught. That is a
Yes.
sick lie
Yeah.
when you get into it.
Right.
Yeah, but
This is
mm,
what you call dissociation. Dissociation
yeah.
is one of these structures of the consciousness in which you literally cannot face the anxiety, so you split your mind. They talk about multiple personality disorder, dissociation. Dissociation runs parallel with regression. They're very, very similar. In fact, some psychologists insist on their differences, but that's a technical detail that I really don't bother getting into. I think it's not that valuable. But that doesn't mean that they don't both apply. You can be dissociated, and you can be regressed. Either way, they're pathological. It wouldn't matter which. Oh, sorry, repressed. Repression, yeah, repression and dissociation have, a similar goal in mind, which is the splitting off of content that is affronting. But again, it all would boil back to the shame and the guilt. These are two things that the soul wants to escape. Nobody likes to be under the shame, and nobody likes to be under the guilt. You see? So, as I said, in existential psychology, the
Mm,
key there, not in regular psychology, but in existential terms, the therapist would be very concerned about his client.
mm,
When the client comes in, he's not assuming that you're there for good reasons. Remember we talked about misosophy, right? We talked about self-deception. Self-deception can also lead you into therapy where you want that priest, number one, right? And you know that you feel the rising of this shame or the guilt, and you're there to get readjusted to the inauthentic world. And 9 times out of 10, the therapist helps you do that. So he's not an alpha man. He's not a voice that represents the self at all. He represents the voice of society. That's what most of your psychiatrists are. That's why they're billionaires. That's why they peddle what they do. They know exactly what role they're fulfilling. That's why they didn't like Freud. The very fact that the APA, American Psychiatric Association, didn't like Freud and the AMA didn't like him either, should tell you everything that you've got to read this man. You've got to know what he was talking about. You see? Now, the existentialist psychologist, they're different. They're influenced by Otto Rank, by Martin Heidegger, by Gabriel Marcel. And they're saying, no, we're looking for the client who's got a shame problem. They're more of an outsider. They don't want to be adjusted to the abnormal world. They're here because they hear the voice of their conscience, which is trying to separate them from this acculturation, this adjustment to the world. And we want to back that up. We want to lie them down and show them there's nothing wrong with them, right? We want to reinforce the sense of individualism. Yeah. And we want to encourage them to feel that there's something right with them. Remember, you and I talked about the hero, psychology of the hero, not the abnormal. Right. This is where we are. Now we're here with Abraham Maslow and with R.D. Laing and with different psychologists who say this person is in a state of trauma because the heroic side of them has been suppressed. We want to encourage it.
bring back the artist. Yeah, bring back
Bring
the
back the
artist.
artist.
Isn't that part of it? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And we want to get rid of this overtly feminized, socialized, or culturized self. And we don't have a rule, right? We don't know. For some people, this could be getting back with nature, or for another person, it may not be that at all. It could be something totally different. It could incorporate dreams. for one guy and not dreams for another. It could be creativity for one. It could be a host of things. We'll deal with the individual case when we find it. There is no formula per se. There are people who are genuine outsiders and who've done nothing but suffer every time that their superegos tried to adjust them to the world. They've suffered enormously, more than another person. The carrot isn't working for them. But these are not discontents. These are not people who are coming to therapy because, woe is me, I ran out of central distraction. Keep putting my coin in and I keep pulling the lever and nothing's coming out. So now I'm really discontented. Now I cry tears. Now I have my insomnia. Now I have my rage against everything and anything. I don't know what. Now I'm a social justice warrior. The existentialist therapist won't see you. You go, no, why don't you go and take some pills or something? You're a hopeless fucking case. So that's why existential psychology isn't well known. It's not even hardly functioning anymore because they couldn't find anybody. There's nobody coming for that reason.
Yeah, there's no authentics left. Yeah,
No, everybody
yeah,
lines
crazy.
up on one side for the pill,
Yeah,
the happy pill, the artificial
yeah.
happiness, the
It's the quick
adjustment,
answer.
lower that guilt. But when they say, but the shame of living is, well, I'll just handle that. I'll go to get the pill. The pill takes away all. I'm comfortably numb.
Comfortably numb.
Yeah, but at what
That's
price?
it.
It all comes back to that
Yeah.
idea. At what price? The price of destroying yourself. Then you tell me that now you're going to wear a badge of being a conservative or a Democrat, a Republican or Democrat. You actually now think that you still have a role to go out there and solve the world's problems? You, a mutilated
Exactly.
thing stitched up at the back, has the audacity to delude yourself that you're now going to fix the world's problems because you've read some Karl Marx or something? Or you went to Harvard? Or you listen to Barack fucking Obama? You know, I mean, what? This is all just cultism. And all they're going to do is sell you a woo metaphor that you'll, in another contrived, it's the same tea in different cups.
Don't you know it wasn't real communism?
That's right. We'll give you a cultural version now. Oh, they have 100 ways. 100 ways. So it's not socialism, it's communism. It's not communism, it's socialism. It was progressivism. All the isms and ologies. Some of
I'm
them
just
are
thinking,
bankrupt. Some of them are dead years ago, and they're still wheeling it out.
go join feminism, isn't it? Yeah.
That's
Oh,
right.
yeah, I'm thinking,
Feminism is dead years ago when you know what you're dealing with.
and maybe even next time we might get into more. I like knowing how the architects of control use this information that we've been dealing with in order to sort of engage in controlling the population. And maybe somebody who haven't come across yet, like Herbert Marcuse and that sort of Frankfurt School, because we spoke a bit about bread circuses and all of these kind of things. But maybe that's something to touch on next time. But there's a few different things we'll maybe get into. Any final last few
Definitely.
words, or should we call it there, Michael?
No, I think that's good, man. I think these are great questions again, as usual. Thanks for reading those quotes and passages. That was really well done. Glad we could get into that article because it helps to summarize a lot of the points,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah,
And
yeah.
believe
Brilliant.
me, it's not because I'm wearing any t-shirt, but
Mm,
I do know after years and years of study how much mutilation has been done to some of the thinkers, the great thinkers. I'm very, very onto that. I'm very, very aware of how some very, very important teachings
mm,
have been disfigured. Yeah. And I'm not one to allow that on my watch, So great,
yeah.
great guns there, Matty. Thank you very much.
Yeah, fantastic. And we'll try to bring out those great ideas and here for future generations to try and bring forward too. We can't let them go by. People need them. And
That's
so,
right.
yeah, the pleasure's all mine yet again. Thank you very much, Michael, for coming once more. And thank you to everyone else for watching as well too. Hopefully you gained a lot from this, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you again.